Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Strategic Pricing, How to Maximize Occupancy and Profit. In this presentation, you'll learn how to set the right price for your property using variable and dynamic pricing principles to account for things like occupancy, seasonality, and your competition. You'll also learn how to identify your peak and shoulder seasons, when to use things like minimum nights, lock fees, sliding rates, specials and packages, gift certificates, and more. And in addition, we will also discuss multiple revenue management strategies to strike a balance in both occupancy and profitability. But first, a little about me. My name is Gavin Wadsworth. I'm a hospitality researcher and marketing writer at ResNexus, and I also manage our webinar schedule. Today's topic is one I've talked about a few times in the past, and there's a reason for that. And that's that this is one of the most underutilized tools that independent businesses have access to. So let's go ahead and get into it. To start with, when we talk about strategic pricing, we're really talking about revenue management. Revenue management is the application of consumer analytics to ensure that you're selling the right product to the right customer at the right time and for the right price. In other words, revenue management means having a cohesive strategy by understanding your customers and their buying habits and their preferences and what they're willing to spend based on all of those factors. So revenue management is actually an inclusive term that describes the use of the following pricing techniques and tactics. You've got variable pricing, dynamic pricing, and yield management. So we're going to go over all three of those today. So let's begin with a closer look at variable pricing. Variable pricing is the practice of charging different prices for different elements of value. For example, a room with a standing tub or one without. Or maybe one room has a unique view or amenity that another one doesn't. There might be some traits about your units that give them different levels of appeal to your guests that you might not immediately be aware of. Variable pricing means recognizing the differences between your units and then pricing them appropriately in relation to each other based on things like their type and their amenities. So, for example, these glamping tent sites both have the same amenities except for the beds. The double safari tent has 2 queen beds instead of 1. Thus, one is more expensive than the other. That one's pretty obvious. But when it comes to amenities, isn't a glamping tent or yurt with electricity worth more than one without? And then what about things like Wi-Fi? Basically, variable pricing means recognizing that all rooms or units are not created equal. Each product has a different value based on the value it offers to the consumer. Imagine if airlines did not use variable pricing. So whether you're flying first class or coach, every flight is $200, no matter where you're going, no matter when you're going, or when you bought the ticket, or the time of arrival. So that would be pretty convenient to always know exactly how much a flight costs, and it would certainly make some airline people's jobs a lot easier. But just imagine how much revenue would be lost, as well as the chaos it would cause in the market. You'd have first-class direct flights to Hawaii that would sell out faster than you can blink, while multiple layover flights to Nowheresville would be pretty much without passengers. Instead, airlines use even more variable pricing techniques called attribute-based shopping. And that just means that they let the traveler choose some add-ons or other factors to further curate the product or service that they pay for. And each attribute modifies the final cost in some way. So here's an example. First class has always had bigger TVs and better seats and often a meal. But now some airlines allow you to pay more money at almost any moment before the flight to get a seat with more legroom. And also dedicated overhead bin space, and then plus free alcohol. Then you have lower end airlines that charge you for everything and twice as much if you do it later. You better pay for that bag online because at the gate it gets real expensive real fast. In reality, all of this is still just different aspects of variable pricing. Attribute-based shopping simply describes allowing flexible timing selection options for the consumer. So going back to the hospitality industry, some other things that might factor into variable pricing are things like when a room is pet friendly, or when it has a jacuzzi instead of a tub, or maybe it has an incredible view out the window, like I said earlier. For campsites and glamping units, other things to look out for are running water, or if it's close to a trailhead, or if it has a strong Wi-Fi connection. The bottom line is your property can choose to increase or decrease the cost of a unit based on factors such as its type, its amenities, or its location. Here's another popular variable pricing strategy, offering different rates based on loyalty and membership programs. And this can easily be done by offering multiple rate types on your website or on your booking engine. You can also offer flexible cancellations with rate types, which is another form of variable pricing that can be very lucrative for you. For example, specific to campgrounds and similar properties, lock fees are another location-based attribute that can benefit from some variable pricing. So for those of you who are not familiar, lock fees usually occur when you let a guest book from a map and they want that specific spot. So maybe they have a family reunion and they want all the tent sites close together. So you can charge for that attribute with lock fees. Otherwise, you as the property would reserve the right to switch them to an identical unit somewhere else on the property. And like I mentioned with the airlines, many properties use text messaging or their online booking engine or their guest portal software to allow the guests to make purchases throughout the stay. Some of the most common for campgrounds and glamping are s'mores kit, firewood, and ice, that kind of thing. For bed and breakfast and boutique hotels, some popular add-ons are things like roses, chocolates, and wine, or there's also souvenir type items like mugs. And while it is important to let guests purchase retail items during their stay, including add-ons as part of a package before their stay has even more benefits. So the main difference between add-ons and packages is that with a package, it does require at least an overnight stay. So you're packaging an add-on along with the stay. Did you know that guests who purchase packages tend to spend more on their units, book further in advance, and are less likely to cancel their bookings compared to customers who opt for standalone units? Guests who go for a package deal also tend to book more nights. All told, these guests pay around 30% more in average daily room or site rates. Some of the most common packages include location-based attractions. So this could be fishing, or entrance to a national park, or tickets to a local winery. Ask yourself why people come to your area and what attractions are nearby. When you can take some of the guesswork out of the equation, this reduces travel planning hassle and incentivizes the guest to book with you sooner. You have increased value based on the level of product offered. And then there's partnership vendors. So in this example, these properties have partnered with local vendors to provide 10% savings on harbor kayak tours, river tours, mountain bike tours, and paddle boat tours. We also see a possible yoga session. Again, these packages enhance the guest experience while also providing kickback revenue share with the local partners. And lastly, couples packages for getaways are always a popular one. These are especially effective in future email marketing campaigns. Ultimately, the added value that a package brings to a property will be determined by how appealing and relevant it is to travelers. And as always, know your customer and make sure you're tailoring these add-ons and packages to that customer. Lastly, glamping and bed and breakfast industries share a natural, unique stay experience in common. The bed and breakfast industry has a natural package advantage as they often offer a gourmet breakfast with their rooms. So when guests are searching, they usually agree to a higher base unit rate because of this value add. Guests know that they might find a cheaper place to stay elsewhere, but they know they will get a more unique experience and a delicious breakfast when they stay with a bed and breakfast. So adding a $10 breakfast that you can increase your unit stay by $25 might be worth considering for your investment. As with all forms of revenue management, variable pricing can be something you experiment with. Try taking a critical eye to your property, figure out which units have more value than others, and then price them a little differently. Make sure you provide pictures and descriptions that show why they have more value, and see if guests are going for it. You can also play with add-ons and packages to see how much more money you make. And if not, you can always just reverse it. Alright, so that was all the first part of revenue management, which was variable pricing. Now we're going to take a look at the second aspect of revenue management, which is dynamic pricing. Dynamic pricing is all about timing and recognizing that there's a higher demand for your availability during certain times, usually of the week or times of the year. Now, obviously, there's weekends. That's a higher commodity than weekday reservations because most people plan their trips around Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But there's also things like seasonal trends, such as events and holidays. Do you have an annual event like a concert or a fair? Do you see a lot of weddings in August? And what about holidays? There's things like Independence Day, Labor Day, Memorial Day. These are all calendar dates that you can safely predict will have a higher demand than other dates. So dynamic pricing is all about market predictions. What are the travel behaviors that you can anticipate in advance and price appropriately for? When do you start hitting 100% occupancy in the year? And are you frequently 100% occupied on the weekends? To prevent your property from hitting 100% occupancy too soon, as well as to make the most revenue possible, we recommend using the following basic dynamic pricing strategies. The first step is to have higher rates on the weekends. A lot of new property owners start with a flat rate for their rooms or units, which tends to be a pretty big mistake. Then identify and implement seasonal rates for holidays and events. In your busy season, we recommend setting minimum nights. This is a great dynamic pricing strategy because you earn more revenue by separating the guests that are willing to stay longer and pay more during a peak time or season. It also helps reduce the amount of maintenance for the rooms or units. Some properties even set smart minimum nights. This is when your property management system's minimum night requirement automatically drops away if some of the sites go unsold by a set date. So, for example, instead of requiring 4 nights, it will drop down to 3 or 2 a certain number of days before the booking is made. So basically what that does is allows the people to plan their longer stays further in advance, which is what you want, and then as the time comes closer, those smaller gaps get filled up with smaller bookings. So overall, you're filling up your calendar more than you would have otherwise. And during your slower seasons, we suggest adding sliding rates to help encourage longer stays. So this is similar to minimum nights, but it kind of attacks it in the other direction. So instead of just flat out requiring a minimum number of nights, you would offer a discount incentive for longer stays. So for example, if you book 2 nights, you get the third night 50% off. That would be a sliding rate. I can't say enough that one of the best ways to make the most of a busy season is to encourage your guests to book longer stays, or rather to show more preference to guests who book longer stays. A property peppered with a lot of single night stays on the weekends might be missing out on profits from a smaller number of longer stays. The most common minimum night rule that we see is that if a guest wants to book a room or a unit on a Friday, that they have to book Saturday as well. Or during especially busy times, you might even have a blanket 2 or 3 night minimum for an entire date range. On the flip side, with sliding rates, you can discount slightly to encourage more nights, say at 25 to 50% off. The third night still increases your revenue without increasing your overall turnover cost. Let's take a look at a more specific and more accurate example. This is what a typical property might see over the course of a year. One thing to pay attention to is that there are times your property might have little peaks in between seasons. With that in mind, let's take a look at a property's actual occupancy data for a complete year. As you can see, it follows our more detailed model pretty closely, though that won't always be the case. So let's take a look and see if we can figure out what's going on here. At first glance, it appears that this property gets a little bump in December. That must mean they get a fair amount of business for the holiday season. Better than November anyway. In fact, the data shows that they were practically full from the 25th through to the 31st, but the rest of December was pretty slow for them, hence the 49% occupancy average. They also get a slight bump for New Year's. Another spike occurs in February. Looks like Valentine's Day is pulling some weight there. Then from March onward, we're in the low season, but steadily rising as the weather gets warmer until we hit May and early June. Now we're in the shoulder season, where it's not the busiest it'll get, but we know it's coming at the end of June. And then July and August are our major months at the highest peaks, and then we're coming back down to a shoulder and then into low again for the winter. But let's take a closer look at our little peak in December to see more about what's happening. So here is the same data, just we're zooming into December. And what we find is that every month actually has its own little peaks. These could be hidden trends when you look a little closer. So for the month's average, they went below 50% occupancy, but as you can see, they alternated between slow days and spikes before it all ramped up for the holidays. It's no surprise that each of those big spikes lands squarely on a weekend, while the weekdays don't get as much attention. This looks like a great opportunity to try out some different revenue management strategies for next December. For that first weekend in December, maybe we can increase our weekday occupancy by offering a sliding rate discount of 15 to 25% if they book 3 nights or more. That might push some guests over the edge and increase your occupancy for both weekday and for that weekend. For the second weekend, since our occupancy was fairly high, I might increase the weekend rate slightly and pair a 15 to 25% discount if they book 3 nights or more to increase my weekday occupancy. And then from the 19th to the 31st, it looks like they're around 80% occupied. That's a really great season. If that is a consistent trend year over year, it might be a good idea to actually increase rates for that time period. In addition, I would probably add some minimum night rules, requiring at least a 3-night stay. Since it's just before Christmas, you might be able to increase total revenue by throwing in some variable pricing by offering a hot cocoa add-on as a package. And as you can see with this example, we're offering both increase rates and discount options depending on the trend for that time period. I recommend you do the same exercise for all the months so that you can find the peaks within the peaks or within the slow seasons. For example, this property sees a peak in February that comes in from Valentine's Day, similar to what we saw with Christmas and also with New Year's. And even in November, which has the lowest occupancy, they still have some spikes for Thanksgiving and Veterans Day. And then for the busy and shoulder seasons, I recommend you look for the peaks within the peaks by studying your current year as the advanced bookings come in. You should also check how soon your season is filling up and evaluate how early you're implementing your discounting incentives. Now let's move on to the third aspect of revenue management. Yield management means changing your prices to match fluctuations in supply and demand based on occupancy. So what does that mean? Well, in other words, if your property is filling up unexpectedly quickly and your dynamic pricing wasn't prepared for it, you can simply increase your rates on a sliding scale based on your occupancy. The benefit of yield management is that it's extremely reliable at reacting to the market to help make sure you're making the most of your slow and your busy times. Basically, with yield management, you charge differently depending on 1, how far in advance the guest makes a reservation, and 2, your occupancy rate at the time of booking. So we're going to do a quick crash course in supply and demand because it's really relevant for yield management. So supply and demand are tied to price. Low supply and low price means high demand. And then conversely, high supply and high price means low demand. Your quantity is your number of available units, and that doesn't change a whole lot unless you're making some renovations or something. So the main lever you have to play with is price. Optimizing your pricing to make the most of supply and demand and hitting that sweet spot is called economic equilibrium. This is where you're maximizing revenue by selling the most units for the most money. Now, let's see what happens when the price is too high. The supply is much higher than the demand. For a property, this looks like a lot of empty beds or units. You might be leaving money on the table because your occupancy is too low. So let's take a look at another scenario. When we price too low, then demand for the product increases, and you'll soon run out of supply. In other words, you've left money on the table, but this time for a different reason, because the customers were willing to pay more. This results in 100% occupancy, which means you're pretty busy, but it also means you're turning lots of people away. If you use yield management effectively, you should be able to stay in the maximum revenue zone. So that's interesting, but what does it mean for revenue management? Well, by looking at your occupancy reports from past years, you can be more informed about when the demand is high. And this allows you to make educated decisions regarding yield management, just as it did with dynamic pricing. Remember that property I just showed? Imagine if this property isn't using any kind of yield management. What could they do throughout the year to boost their profits? Well, the most obvious place to look is those peak months, July and August. Almost every day in those months was hitting 100% occupancy. That can mean one of two things. Either you've set your rates at the exact optimum level with no guests being turned away, or your pricing is too low. Odds are it's the second one. So let's put in some yield management there. If it were me, I would add a yield management rule to increase the rate 15% whenever occupancy is above 50%. Then I'd probably do it again at 70%. I know a property that increased the base room rate across the board by 15% whenever occupancy was 50% or higher. It's a very simple and, in my opinion, a pretty conservative rule. But in the month of June, the result was that almost 8% of this property's revenue came directly from their automated yield management. They made about $160,000 in that month, so that means they made an extra $12,500 from yield management alone. Here's an example of another property that's using more intensive yield management rules. Last year, this property increased its rates for early birds who are booking 2 or more months out, which is kind of interesting. And then the other 4 rules are all relating to occupancy, marking up the base rate of all the rooms depending on how full the property will be at that time. Throughout the year, this property made over $33,500 off of yield management alone, representing 5% of their total revenue. So why would you increase your rates for people who book a long time in advance? Shouldn't it be the other way around? Well, it kind of depends on the traveler behavior in your area. When people come to stay at your property, is it typically a last-minute thing, or have they been planning this trip for months? If most of your guests do book far in advance, then this strategy actually makes sense. It's not long-term trip planners you have to worry about because they'll always book far in advance. You're more focused on those spur-of-the-moment people who are looking for a place to stay, and you'd rather they come stay with you rather than your competitors. Maybe they have the reverse strategy, and last-minute bookings are more expensive. If that's the case, this makes you the clear winner to those customers. Plus, this strategy protects you from charging too little during your busy season. The fact of the matter is that we are all conditioned to expect yield management, and yes, I'm going to talk about airlines again. It's kind of like bidding at an auction. The starting bid is typically a good deal. Demand is higher for a cheap item than an expensive item, especially if the supply is so low. But then more bids start coming in and the price gets higher. The higher the price gets, the more people slow down in their bidding. The demand is going down. And finally, the item is sold to the highest bidder. In other words, to the person with the highest demand for the auctioned item. But it works both ways. The fact of the matter is that in hospitality and the travel industry, we serve a perishable product. So with that in mind, yield management works both to increase and decrease prices depending on the preparation of your guest and how soon you want to fill your occupancy. And bottom line, if you don't sell a unit night, you won't ever get another chance to sell that night. That's why some properties use discounting rules in their yield management strategy. Discounts work to increase or maintain occupancy rates. Let's take a look at an example scenario. Let's say your occupancy rate is about 20%, at a rate of $150 around 90 days before a given stay date. Then, around the 45 to 30 day mark, you start to see demand increase, and so you raise your rates, in this case to $160. Then one strategy is to either keep your rate the same or increase it even more so that your occupancy isn't as high as it could be. You won't necessarily sell out, but you're making more money and working less during the high demand time. This is shown in the graph as occupancy plateaus as the stay date approaches on the right. You have to decide what is best for your business. Let's compare two businesses and their yield management strategies. The first property is represented by the dotted line. For example, by discounting your rate 90 days out, you can quickly increase your occupancy rate. Then once you hit 50% occupancy, you can raise your rate a greater amount to slow demand and increase revenue, just like the non-discounting property did. However, note that because I'm in a better position occupancy-wise, I can afford to let my rate be higher than it would have been in the previous scenario, illustrated here with a dotted line. Plus, if some guests cancel or you want to increase occupancy even more, you can discount again to sell to last-minute travelers. So you might use yield management to discount to get your first 20% of occupancy quickly, and then use yield management to increase your rate to keep your occupancy lower but make more money. Ultimately, how you choose to use yield management to discount and increase rates is all up to you. When considering yield management, I recommend you determine your GOPAR. This exercise gives you the insight to see how much profit you're making per unit per night versus just revenue. For those of you who are not familiar with the term GOPAR, it stands for Gross Operating Profit per Available Room, and it's a standard used in the hotel industry. So the formula is total gross revenue minus operating expenses. Then that number is divided by total room nights. GOPAR accounts for occupancy, number of units, unit revenue, ancillary revenue, and operating expenses, because revenue isn't just a one-to-one ratio to overall profits. For example, there are maintenance expenses for units, food and beverage costs, commissions, marketing costs, and on and on. If you have an advertising budget for your property, GOPAR will also account for that. So let's do an example where we will calculate a 12-unit property's GOPAR for June. For June, our 12 units booked for a total of $68,134. We also sold $5,128 worth of s'mores kits and firewood. This brings our total gross revenue to $73,262. Next, we'll tally up and subtract our operating expenses. This includes our property mortgage, payroll, marketing, utilities, food and firewood costs, for a total of $19,622 for the month. When we subtract our operating expenses from our total gross revenue, we get $53,640, which when we divide it by the total unit nights in June, which is 30 days times 12 units, we know that we made $149 per night on average. If we multiply that by the 12 units, we get an average profit of $1,788 per night. After you determine GOPAR, I like to use the expenses to determine what your average night expenses are. It's pretty simple. You just divide your expenses by the total unit nights, and then multiply it by the total number of units, which in this case is 12, which comes to a total of $55 per night per unit. Now, why do we determine this number? Well, it's because it's good to know how much profit you're making side by side with your nightly expenses. Now we have your current baseline range. This helps you make smarter decisions when it comes to revenue management, especially yield management rules. For example, in my busy season and weekends, could I use yield management rules to push my average per night per unit above $149? $5 more would mean an extra $1,800. For my slow season, I know that my yield management discounting should never take me below $55. In other words, you want to make it worth your while. This is the minimum threshold to make money on a unit, so don't go under it. I also know that I have to make an average of $660 per night to cover all my expenses. If I'm closed for a couple months of the year, my nightly average expenses might be even more. Now, this doesn't go over all possible scenarios, but it should give you a general idea. Again, at the end of the day, you have to ask if automated yield management is right for your business. Well, here are some good questions to ask yourself. Is your occupancy over 70%? Do you run 100% occupancy during certain times of the year, especially maybe on weekends? Check your trends and look back at your last 2 to 3 years to see how often those first two are happening. And I say that because COVID definitely changed a lot of the factors, and we are approaching more normal seasons. If you find your property answers yes to those questions, then we recommend you ease into automated yield management with the following 2 rules. First, if your occupancy is between 71 to 90%, increase your rack rate by 10% or $10, whichever you're most comfortable with. The second rule is if your occupancy is 91% or higher, then you might want to consider going up to 20% or $20. ResNexus does allow you to automatically set your yield management rules based on occupancy in this way. Perhaps the most important thing you can do with your pricing strategy and revenue management is to accurately measure your results. This is when you really get to release your inner scientist and start evaluating how everything is working. Look at your year-over-year data. If you tried changing up your rates this month compared to last year at the same date range, did your revenue improve or not? If revenue management is the strategy behind selling and pricing your inventory, then having no strategy at all is the worst revenue management you can do. Flat rate pricing is a big indicator that a business has no revenue management strategy. Flat rate pricing means every product has the same price regardless of supply and demand, customer insights, the quantity that are purchased, and many other factors. The bottom line is, if you're using flat rate pricing, you're leaving money on the table. Before we end today, I wanted to go over some additional revenue management and pricing strategies that we see properties using. One revenue management strategy that is often overlooked is your property's deposit rules. More advanced deposits often mean it's easier to average out your operation costs. In addition, it can lower your cancellation rate. A unique scenario I've seen is using deposit rules based on the dates of a solar eclipse. There are usually 2 to 5 of them per year, with a total eclipse taking place every 18 months. So when the property is in the path of a solar eclipse, the property requires 100% deposit during those high demand dates. Speaking of which, check and see how close you are to the path of totality for our next big solar eclipse on April 8th in 2024. People are already making travel plans, so if you're on that route, that could be a good opportunity for you. More common scenarios include travel protection and the flexibility of cancellation, meaning usually the property will collect 100% deposit to provide the additional service of travel protection or a lower rate for non-flexible cancellation. Another great way to increase revenue is gift certificates. Some properties promote themselves by providing gift certificates and gift cards to local businesses for the holiday rewards for their employees. Another great idea is to have your property reach out to other businesses and incentivize them to do a retreat. In addition, you can reward your top spenders. I highlight this example from the bed and breakfast industry. This B&B in Maine rewards any guest that spends $1,000 at the property. They get a $50 gift certificate towards their next stay. This, of course, encourages repeat bookings and therefore more revenue. Probably the most important additional pricing strategies involve online travel agencies, or OTAs. OTAs are great at introducing your property to new travelers. In fact, it's one of the best ways to get found and get booked. In regards to search traffic, millions of people visit these sites every month. Because many properties look at their units as an expiring product, they use OTAs like Airbnb, Vrbo, Booking.com, TripAdvisor, The Dirt, Book Outdoors, Glamping Hub, and many more to advertise. These properties recognize that they are still making a profit on that unit that they wouldn't have sold anyway. The OTAs also generate the billboard effect, which is demonstrated by the following research from Google. Google finds that when someone is planning a vacation, they follow this typical path. Often, they search based on a place they want to go, or by activities or things to do in the local area. Usually, the top results on Google are OTAs like Expedia, TripAdvisor, Booking.com, or Airbnb. The traveler will then identify some places that stand out to them, but they won't necessarily book at that time. They first want to talk to their partner, their spouse, or their friend. Maybe they'll watch some videos about what they're going to do, and it'll kind of build excitement into escaping the day-to-day. Then they'll come back to the narrowed down choices and Google them to see their direct website, often comparing it to the OTAs. And finally, they'll complete the process by booking either directly or with an OTA. Bottom line, a majority of your guests still want to book direct. So make sure that you have a good-looking website and online booking engine. Plus, a great pricing strategy is to have a lower book direct rate than what you're listing on the OTA. Here are some basic tips when using OTAs. First off, some of the best uses of OTAs are to use them for social proof or reviews. So make sure you get some bookings through them. And as I already mentioned, you can offset some of the commission fees by encouraging guests to book direct with a lower rate or a package offering. Next, use them to sell weekdays or slower season weekends. Many properties don't need help filling their weekends, so they block those so that people book direct. In addition, during your busy season, you might not need help getting found, so you reduce the amount of inventory you show during your busy season. OTAs are great at getting you new guests. They are not great at getting that same guest again. Why? Because travelers typically use OTAs to explore a new area that they haven't been to before. So once your guest has booked and stayed with you, the way to increase your return guest rate is to email market them directly in the future. We recommend collecting their birthday or anniversary date, and then email marketing to them on those dates or for other important occasions. At the end of the day, it's really important that your business owns the guest information, not the OTA. In addition, as you plan your marketing communications, make sure that you plan out your season with your revenue management strategy in mind. All right, and now with all that, we've finally come to the end. I'll get to the Q&A in just a moment, so feel free to start dropping your questions into the questions field. In the meantime, I'd like to say that if you enjoyed this webinar and would like to view any of our past ones, you can do so by going to our website, resnexus.com. When you scroll to the bottom, you'll see a webinars button, which will take you to our entire library of past webinars. You can also register for upcoming webinars on this page. All right, and now we've come to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So go ahead and submit your questions, and we'll try and get those answered for you as fast as we can and in the order they appear.
And today I've actually got Nathan Mayfield, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at ResNexus, who is going to be on to help us out with the Q&A for today. So thanks for coming on.
Hey, thank you, Gavin. So it looks like I have some great questions already. One is from Michael. He says, can you tell us how to best communicate our sliding rates to our prospective guests? We've offered multiple multi-night discount, but guests don't usually find it unless we verbalize it to them. So to answer that, I would say with ResNexus, there's a couple great ways that you can do that with sliding rates. One is to have, if you don't use them, I highly recommend them, which are sidebars, which is available on the booking engine. I also would recommend that you maybe make a must-see tab. Oftentimes properties do this with specials and packages or add-ons. And so as soon as they select their room or unit, they can see that special or package that's on there as well. By putting it at the beginning with those sidebars, one thing that's unique about ResNexus 2 is that it kind of dummy proofs the process. So if you have, book 2 nights, get the third night 50% off, it will lock in the 3 nights that are required. It will let them book more, but it won't let them book less. So sidebars is a great way. I also recommend that you maybe make an interest group that you want to send to past guests and do email marketing to notify them of that. That's a great way to increase your return guest rate. So hopefully those are a couple suggestions that would help. And then I have another question from Camille that says, is ResNexus able to integrate with any of the outside resources that help with yield management by looking at rates in the area at large and recommending rates? She was mentioning kind of Airbnb has that, but it's not available through ResNexus. So one thing that ResNexus is currently working on that's in our development schedule as we speak and is under production is that we're going to have a tool that will show the rates and by region and by type. So if even if you're, say, like a bed and breakfast, you might be competing against a glamping unit or vice versa and see what the hotel is. So we are coming out with another report that will show you that information, and that's in the works. In addition, we are currently expanding our API to work with revenue management companies such as Price Labs is kind of our first focus with ResNexus. And we're making an open API so that they can build to us and be able to connect to ResNexus, be able to offer those suggestions and even change your rate if you trust them to do so. So that is again in production. We hope to have early testing of that for early in 2024. All right. So where do we find the daily occupancy graph in ResNexus? I believe that is under your under reports under occupancy, and we are releasing. We have just enhanced that report that is coming out soon, where you can actually put in the date range per month, and it will show you just that month, and it will show you the occupancy for that month by day, by individual day of that month. That is relatively new and is releasing in the next couple of weeks. Right now, it will just show you by month and won't let you drill down. But based off of kind of the feedback and off of what we were showing you in this webinar, we wanted to allow you to see that occupancy, see those peaks within your peaks on the month. So look for that in your occupancy report under reports. You'll see that shortly. I have another question. Can yield management change the price and then round to the nearest dollar? Yes, you can. There's a lot of yield management rules that you can do depending on, you can do a percentage or you can do a flat dollar amount increase. As far as, I think, rounding off, I'm not sure if I quite understand the question, if you're asking it to round off like taxes and stuff like that that are naturally charged. But as far as the rate that your base room rate, you're able to do it by an additional dollar amount or by a percentage. whatever you want. The dollar amount, of course, would keep it pretty flat. If your base rate's like $100 and you say, hey, increase it by 120, then that would be 120, but you'll still have your taxes and fees or whatever that you have to charge for the state. Our system won't round that up, but it can hold flat rates to the nearest dollar on the kind of base rate. Thank you for that question. I have another one for Michael. We're in Alaska. Sorry, we're in Alaska and we get a lot of one and done traffic. They come to Alaska once every 15 years. Do you have advice on price strategies for this model? So, one thing that you can do that was kind of shown earlier on in this presentation is if you have a lot of last minute people, again, you can have a yield management rule that when your occupancy is high, it's going to increase the rate. The other thing is if you know that they're kind of coming really far in advance, and you know the majority of clients are that way, I would recommend that you actually increase the price with the yield management rule the further that they book out, because you'll always get that traffic. And then what I would do is I would increase the rate yet again for that last minute traveler if your season's really strong. If not, you might want to lower that rate. Hopefully that answers that question on what to do. Like I said, one of the funniest things I ever ran into was in Utah, which is where ResNexus is based. I went down to a campground down in, near the national parks and said, what do you like most about what you do? And they were like, hey, we love the time freedom and everything. I said, okay, what do you like the least? And they're like, I don't like the campers in July. And I laughed and said, why not? And they said, I'm so full and I'm 100% occupied and I don't have the staff and I don't have the people to take care of it. And I'm working like 50 to 60 hour weeks and I just don't want to do it. If not, it goes even sometimes up to, even more hours than that. I said, well, to make it worth your time if it's a last minute booking, I would recommend that you maybe add a yield management rule that increases the rate on that. That if it's a couple days before, or if your occupancy is that high, definitely make it increase it by $50 or something. That lets you hire more staff, and if not, that lets you make more money with doing less labor. So it depends on what you want to accomplish. Another question is, does ResNexus have a reporting function that summarizes how far in advance guests are booking? For example, broken into categories 60 to 365 days in advance, 59 to 30 days in advance, 29 to 2 days in advance, 48 hours in advance. I believe that I know that it does with the night audit report is the answer to that. It gives your averages on what your booking average is for the next kind of 14 days. I would need to, just being honest, I need to check. If not, I think it's planned in that revenue management report that will compare you to other parts of the system. But I will follow up, Alec, on that one, and I can send you an email on that one once I know the answer. So I believe that there's a report that does that. I'm not sure where it is. Looks like I'll just wait a little bit, maybe give it one more minute for any other questions, because I know sometimes you have to think about them. We'll just wait one more minute, and if there's no other questions, then, oh, there's another one. Okay. Just another request to see an advanced guest report on how far advanced the guests are booking. So, yep, I'll send that to you as well, Michael. Just looking to see if we have any more questions before we end today.
Yeah, a lot of great questions, a lot of great engagement. Thanks everyone for taking the time out of your day to learn more about this topic of revenue management and strategic pricing. Thanks, Nathan, for coming on to help me out with the Q&A. We'll give, like I said, we'll give it another like 30 seconds or so for any final questions. We got a lot of people saying thank you in the questions as well. So you're welcome, and thank you all as well. All right, everybody. Well, I hope you all have a great rest of your day.